How is the American religious landscape evolving? And how do members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints fit into that shifting picture? The short answer is that the United States is becoming much more polarized, and churches might be feeling the brunt of those effects. This has led to a great sifting, is what scholars call it, as devout Christians are often becoming more conservative. American progressives are fleeing the pews, and the nation is becoming less outwardly religious overall. This God gap, as it's referred to, has only grown in the most recent decades, to the point that where it is exceptionally stark, a hallmark of our partisan age, the religious right and the secular left. I've done a few videos in the last year concerning recent survey data of Latter-day Saint belief, belonging, and political affiliation. I spoke about how Latter-day Saints are becoming less religious in practice. I surveyed recent data that shows how at least the American church membership seems to be actively losing members. And I even recently engaged new data analysis that attempts to group Latter-day Saints into different categories according to their religious and theological and political views. I'll link to those videos in the description. But in this video, I want to take a different approach. Rather than focusing narrowly and looking outward, we're going to focus on the outward picture and then narrow in on the Mormons. And to do this, I'm going to talk about a recent and excellent book, Dr. Ryan Burge's The Vanishing Church, How the Hollowing Out of Our Moderate Congregations is Hurting Democracy, Faith, and Us, just out from Brazos Press. So in this video, I'll introduce the broader topics and things at stake. I'll then introduce the book, the numbers of which are quite startling, and there's lots of really great graphs in here. I was generally shocked at several of the findings. And then I'll interview the author, Dr. Burge, after which I'll posit some direct lessons I think we could glean for the Mormon experience, because it's important to see how Mormons both fit into these larger trends, as well as some ways in which they remain somewhat unique. I recently watched the comedian Taylor Tomlinson's latest special on Netflix, Prodigal Daughter. It's quite funny if you're into that type of humor and adult stand-up, and it's centered around her attempts to overcome the trauma that she experienced while being raised in a devout religious home. This coming out story of trying to overcome the conservative retrenchment of these faith-centered spaces into a much more progressive sphere. Those arguments are actually part of a common narrative. Millennials and Gen Z are growing up to largely reject the faith of their family because it's too conservative, especially on notions like gender and sexuality. Our social media often highlights these voices as hashtag ex-evangelical narratives. But this is just the latest cultural expression of a much longer trend. Back in the 1950s, religion was a part of both the American left and the American right. Both political parties couched their message in religious language. Both the civil rights movement and the conservatives who denounced them identified as Christian nationalists. But yet, now, religion is predominantly seen as a conservative cause, and liberals are typically seen as more secular. This is, however, mostly a modern invention. There's a chicken and the egg debate that goes on here. Did religions become much more conservative, or did the Conservative Party appropriate religion? As a historian, I can point to things like the Southern strategy, in which GOP operatives tried to reach out to the disillusioned white Southerners who hated the Democratic Party for supporting the civil rights movement, and the rise of the religious right, a number of prominent evangelical leaders who courted their religious base into the Republican Party. But in this video, rather than focusing on that historical trajectory and context, we're going to talk about the results, the analytical data that we see through all these surveys and what they mean for our current religious climate. And then we'll get to how the Latter-day Saints fit in. By the way, before I go much further, just a reminder that if you enjoy this type of nerdy content on religion, politics, and history, please make sure you are subscribed to this channel. I do deep dives on topics every Monday. I try to connect the past to the present on Wednesdays, and then I pull back the curtains on the historian's craft every Fridays. And if you do enjoy this content and you want a way to give back, you can become a member of the channel, where for a very nominal fee, you can get early access to the videos, little icons next to your name, and you get the warm feeling of knowing that you are helping both me and my producer Anthony put in the time necessary to address these topics. I also recommend subscribing to my free Kit newsletter, as well as my social media channels where I do short supplemental videos. You can find links in the video description. But all that said, let's get back to the data and the graphs. Dr. Ryan Burge is one of the most respected political scientists studying the modern religious landscape through survey data. He's a huge graph nerd, as you can see in any essay and book that he's written. He is currently the professor of practice at the Danforth Center for Religion and Politics at Washington University in St. Louis, one of the premier academic centers for studying American religion. And until recently, he was pastor in a Baptist Church of America congregation in rural Illinois. But his church recently had to close their doors after being in existence for over a century and a half, one of many mainline Protestant churches that had become lost in the recent culture wars as members have fled these mainline denominations. His latest book is The Vanishing Church: How the Hollowing Out of Modern Congregations is Hurting Democracy, Faith, and Us. And it tells this 7-decade-long story in a very compact volume filled with graphs. And I mean compact. It's only about 200 pages. It's small. You can carry it around in your backpack, in your purse. It's really great. The thesis of the book is simple. In the 1950s, religion was everywhere and it was quite diverse. Churches were a gathering place for diverse voices, backgrounds, and political inclinations. But a slow yet steady shift in the ensuing decades became a fundamental rupture in the 1980s and 90s as religion fell prey to the nation's cultural divisions. Evangelicals became a dominant force on the right, moving from the margins to the mainstream, and the mainline moderate church experienced rapid decline that people were no longer felt comfortable in those moderate spaces. Those dissatisfied with religion therefore left churches altogether, even if they retained some semblance in a belief of God. And this trend is clear. Here's a graph from a Washington Post editorial associated with the book, showing that in 1972, 59% of white evangelicals identified as Democrat and only 32% as Republican. By 2000, those figures had flipped. And that shift has only become more pronounced in the next 2 decades. The result is today we have a very diverse and divisive religious picture. Churches have become more politically, socially, and demographically homogenous. You can largely guess someone's political affiliation based on where they attend church, and you are unlikely to meet people with different views sitting next to you in the pews. It also tells the incredible rise of the nones, those who are not affiliated with the religious group, as the American left, to which the nuns largely belong, is largely seen as outside institutional religion. Now, the one exception to these general trends, of course, are Black Protestants, who have largely remained on part of the Democratic left. The book is well written, tightly argued, and has lots of cool graphs. So let me highlight a few of the key findings before I get to the interview with the author. At the center of the story, in part because it's most personal to Dr. Burge, is the rapid decline of mainline Christians. That probably made up, those mainline churches probably made up of 50% of American congregations in the 1950s. They are now down to about 9% of the population. A rapid and substantial decline that just shows how much things have changed. And though they have a reputation, these mainline churches, of being largely liberal, justified in the case of leadership, the membership has always been quite diverse. So the disappearance of these mainline congregations means the loss of one of the great gathering places of diverse backgrounds in America. Simultaneously, and perhaps as a result of the decline of mainline, we see the rise of the nones, those who do not have religious affiliation. They grew from taking up only 2% of America's population in the 1950s to 5% in the 1970s, and then exploded to 30% more recently. To put that in context, just looking at the shift from 2008 to 2022, the number of people who do not identify as part of a religious tradition grew from 45 million people to 85 million people. That is substantial. also substantial is how politically homogenous they are. They are similar. They are as united in their liberal beliefs as evangelicals are in their conservative beliefs. And importantly, in that group, agnostics and atheists only make up a minority position. A majority of them still have some religious inclinations. They're just not affiliated with a religious institution. Simultaneously, the religious right has grown much more conservative over these same years. Evangelicals predominantly vote for Republicans, and you see this even in other denominations like the Catholics. One of the statistics that really blew me away was the degree to which young Catholic priests are far more conservative than their predecessors. Here's one book from the graph. There are dozens of fascinating charts in the book, but I don't want to give them all away, but here's one. Those Catholics ordained to the priesthood in the 1960s, 68% of them identified their theology as progressive, and only 16% identified their theology as conservative. In the last decade, however, you see this clear change. In the last decade, 84% identify as conservative and only 2% as progressive. And again, these are just Catholic priests in the United States. So in other words, evangelical, Catholics, this religious right is becoming much more homogenous. They left behind these ideologically, politically diverse backgrounds that previous generations had experienced. So, with all that background set, this new partisan age in clear view, let's talk with Dr. Burge. Thank you so much to Dr. Ryan Burge joining me in my video now to discuss his great new book. So let's start at a basic level. Can you briefly explain how the data makes clear that religious communities, just like the rest of America, have become more polarized in recent decades, and how that's actually harmful for our public sphere?
Yeah. So, I mean, the data on this is exceedingly clear that most forms of white Christianity have become more Republican over time. And everyone thinks it's just evangelicals. And it is evangelicals, don't get me wrong. They certainly are very Republican. Most people don't realize that a majority of white evangelicals are actually Democrats in the 1970s. And even through the early 1990s, it was mixed. It was kind of evenly divided, Republicans and Democrats. So what we're seeing here is a very modern incarnation of religion and politics, but it's not just white evangelicals, also white Catholics. 2/3 of white Catholics voted for Trump in 2024, whenever McCain only got 55% of their votes. So, almost every form of white Christianity is becoming more and more polarized, more politically homogenous over time. And, the thing that makes that difficult is now people go to church with people who look like them and think like them and vote like them. And what that does is a couple things. First off, I think it has, and I don't talk about this too much in the book, but I do think it has a tendency to create extreme views inside those communities because there's no one to check you, so it's like you can say things that are pretty nonsensical, maybe far outside the mainstream, and you have no one in your life to say, hey man, we don't do that. We don't say that. And the other thing is it makes us, we are less tolerant of people we don't understand and have no connection to. And, religion's a great way to see people in 3 dimensions. As opposed to the 2 dimensions of your computer screen or your phone screen, where you can pretty much hate people pretty quick, not knowing who they are and what their motivations are and their feelings and what they're struggling with. And, I realized as being part of religious communities my entire life that, man, there's a lot of people I sit next to in the pews who I disagree with on politics. I mean, as far as you can, but I don't hate those people because I see them on a regular basis and other families and other stories. I know how they feel about other issues. So that's actually going to make it harder for us to govern ourselves because now we have this sort of intolerance thing of people they're different than us. And I think, when I wrote the book, I wanted to write it not just saying that the church is declining and church is polarizing, that's bad for church people. I wanted to make the point that that's bad for all of us. Even if you have nothing to do with religion, it's actually making it harder, to be religious and to be a democratic citizen in a functioning democracy because of this religious polarization we're facing right now.
Yeah, I think the key point drives home to where you see in these states that have super majorities of one party or the other, to where those party controls can lead to some rather extreme ideas. I'm in Texas, so I experienced that. I, researched a lot about Utah, but you see this in blue states as well. And I'm glad you brought up Catholics because there's a lot of statistics in your book that really opened my eyes to things, but your data on how Catholic priests have become more conservative over the last few decades, that really blew me away. But another group that really has become much more politically homogenous, creating their own echo chamber that you talk about, is the rise of the nuns, which I know has been a focus of your scholarship even outside this book. What is the rise of these nuns, and why is it important to understand them to comprehend modern American culture?
Yeah, the thing about the nuns is they're such a new phenomenon, really. They were a rounding error in American religion. All the way back into the early 1990s. Just wasn't a group that was studied or thought about that much because they were 5-6% of the population. It just wasn't something we devoted a lot of time to. And now it's 30% of the population. And among Gen Z, it's 45% of Gen Z. So, the future of America is going to be a whole lot less religious than the past of America. And the share of Americans who are Christians and the share of Americans who are non-religious at some point in the future, probably during our lifetimes, will probably be a 1-to-1 ratio. And so what does that feel like? What does that look like? How do Christians reorient their understanding of power and their role in society when they are now not the clear majority, not the overwhelming majority? And I think that, to me, is one of the most interesting and consequential questions that we will face going forward, is that, white Christians have always operated from a position of hegemony, right? That we can sort of run the show and we don't have to ask for permission, and we can just kind of exert our will upon these smaller religious groups. And I think that in many ways has made Christianity sort of like the not officially the religion of the state, but almost certainly, unofficially the religion of the state. And that makes it work differently. Like how you approach people for evangelization efforts or, changing laws, things like that. I do think it changes their entire posture towards evangelization. And then the nuns, as they get larger, they're going to think, well, why are we not having more of a say in politics, right? Like, why are we not enacting more policies and really advocating for what we'd like to see done? Because there's a lot of us, there's 30, 40, 50% of us potentially at some point. So for me, the bigger question there is, can they organize in some type of way to push for a coherent set of pieces of legislation? Because right now I don't think they can. They don't, that's the nice thing about church is you meet all the time. You've got organizational structures, communication structures, and you can really disseminate your ideas easier. The non-religious are all over the board politically, many of them. There are conservative atheists, and most of them are very liberal, but there are conservative non-religious people too. So I think that, to me, is the other big question, is like, how do the nuns coalesce around certain issues they care about a whole lot? What does that look like? What issues can they find common ground on? And then on the other side, can Christians, how do they operate in a world where they are not, the default? And I don't think they have a good answer to that because they've never had to deal with that in American history.
And I think we see this anxiety where they're feeling a bit cornered and embattled, that they're no longer this majority. And so they're acting at a point of anxiety. One of the important nuances that I really appreciate in your book is you emphasize that there's often more of a gap than the general public think between what institutional and ecclesiastical leaders are saying and prioritizing and what the general membership is doing. Why do you think that's such an important lesson to know, and not just assume that members are in lockstep with what their leaders are dictating?
Mm-hmm. This is one of those key discussions in political science over the last 20 years, is like, how deep does polarization go? And there's two theories. One is it goes all the way down, and the other theory is it's just elite polarization, and rank and file folks are actually not that polarized. I'm definitely in camp two. The more you look at the data, the more you realize that, for instance, among Catholics, 95% of Catholics use birth control. A majority of Catholics are in favor of abortion. A majority of Catholics are in favor of capital punishment. So, like, a majority of Catholics don't even understand basic Catholic doctrine like purgatory or transubstantiation. So, it's the idea that, like, well, you go to church because you're sort of doctrinally aligned with, the views of your church, is just sort of demonstrably false. Even questions of evangelicals, like, do you believe there's many ways to heaven? And the majority of evangelicals say yes, that Jesus is not the only way to heaven. So what you sort of realize is that, man, the average person does not create bright lines in their head, right? Where it's clear black and white, clear right and wrong. They kind of engage in situational ethics, like, I don't like abortion, but I don't like it illegal, like kind of that hedging, right? And I think that's lost in the discourse, because the discourse is driven by, if politics was a 1 to 10 scale, it's driven by 1s and 2s and 9s and 10s. not a lot of 4, 5s, and 6s get a lot of play on social media. And I think that's the problem is most Americans are 4, 5, and 6s, and yet they think they're crazy because they're not 1s and 2s or 9s and 10s. And I don't know how to fix that except by, saying in the book, like, I can show you numbers, like showing, like whenever I scroll social media, there should be like a way for me to like write something in a box saying, yeah, 2% of Americans believe this, or, this is a very small version of what people believe. Because I think what most people believe is they see like 500 retweets on something and go, holy crap, like that's a really widely held view. When in reality, you can find 500 people online who'll believe pretty much anything. Mm-hmm. So like, I think that's the problem is social media, like it creates this like funhouse mirror effect of what the world really looks like. And when you actually sit down and talk with people, what you realize that most of them are very sensible, common sense, compromise seeking, they don't have bright lines in their head. And yet those people are being run over by the institutions who do have these bright lines.
Especially when added to these institutions are these social media platforms that are driven by rage and passion, and they're promoting the 1s and 2s and 9s and 10s rather than the 3, 4s and 5s and 6s. Maybe the 3, 4, 5s and 6s need to just come up with better memes and billboards. Maybe that's the problem. While the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is not a focus in this book, you have touched on them in some of your other scholarships. So I'm wondering if you could, since my audience are mostly interested in Mormon history, how do you see the Latter-day Saint tradition fitting within this larger story?
Yeah, so I think what I always think is interesting about Latter-day Saints is in many ways they look like evangelicals, sort of like they should look like evangelicals politically, right? They kind of have rugged individualism. They are very family friendly. They're very pro-capitalist, low government regulation, all these kind of things. But there's something in the data about LDS that makes them distinct. So on questions of like, do you think diversity is a good thing for America? White evangelicals say no, but Latter-day Saints say yes. And I think like we just talked about the hegemony idea. Like white evangelicals have always sort of run this country. White Protestants have run this country. White Catholics have run this country. And so they don't like diversity because for them, diversity is coded as I will be less successful. I will have less power if we're more diverse. And if you're a smaller religious group, and Latter-day Saints, they do see themselves as sort of like a minoritized religious group in America. I actually think that's a huge part of their identity is this idea of they're a minoritized group in America. And all the discrimination and stigma that goes along with that means they're not going to then hoist that discrimination and stigma on other groups. So I do think that's like a really clear delineating point between, like they should vote like Southern Baptists, but they don't because of that little piece. And then you add the piece in of a lot of them have traveled overseas, to go on mission, which means they're much more pro-immigrant than a white evangelical would be. So I do think they're alike in some ways, but also, different in these really distinct ways that makes them a unique, I always say they're generally conservative, but not in the way you think. Right, like not in the current milieu of like the Trump style conservative, much more in the milieu of like the George H.W. Bush style conservative, which is sort of died on the vine, which puts the LDS in a really difficult spot, right? Because like, well, who do we vote for? Because we don't like Trump. We're sure not Democrats, so what do we do?
Right, the old compassionate conservatism that Mitt Romney represented.
That to me is like the median. If I look at the data, that's the median LDS voter is like a Mitt Romney style, like principled conservative, right? Who doesn't like all the brashness and the bravado and the swearing and all the stuff that goes on. So, I do think but there is some evidence that younger LDS tend to be a little less conservative than older LDS. But a huge caveat to that whole thing is we don't know what's going to happen as those younger LDS age into older LDS. Almost certainly they're going to become more conservative because that's just what happens in life. But the other thing about that is that maybe the reason that they become more conservative because the liberal LDS drop out. And so you're sort of left with the more conservative core. So we can't figure that out, by the way. Like mathematically, that's an impossible thing to do, but it could be both and, right?
Yeah, I close my book, American Zion, talking about this dynamic where I say that on the one hand, these young Latter-day Saints might become more conservative like their ancestors did or the previous generations did. On the other hand, what seems to be a core issue for them on LGBTQ and gender rights is the hill that the Latter-day Saint Church is wanting to stake its ground. And so that's going to form this major crash. So while there are these substantial differences between the Latter-day Saints and evangelicals, I'm struck by how your research seems to show that there is a bridge that allows them to work. In your closing chapter, you noted that as Christians have become more embattled and seeking previously surprising alliances, like when they worked with Islamic communities to try to censor LGBTQ education, or working with, heaven forbid, Catholics who they couldn't have conceived of before. Does that then provide a similar space for them to work with groups that they previously denounced as heathens, like the Mormons?
I think that the enemy of your enemy is your friend, right? And the thing I always say is, like, Protestants could yell at Catholics when they were both 40% of America, like, because there's still a lot of, you got to find an enemy, you got to find someone else. And when they were both large, you could just yell at each other about, the Pope and theology or whatever else. But now that both those groups have gotten so much smaller, it's like, wow, man, like we've got to figure out like what we hold in common. And I would not be surprised at all if we do see in some ways white evangelicals lock arms with the Latter-day Saints on some issues. Like, let's be clear, like not across the board. But I think like coalitions, you can build coalitions to get policy passed. And if someone's on your side on this issue, but you disagree with them on every other issue, you just don't talk about the other issues while you're working on this one issue. And so I really do think in the future, you're going to see a whole lot of weird bedfellows, right? With like evangelicals and Catholics and Muslims and LDS, like working for like a religious freedom bill, for instance. Like, I think that's one issue where they all can agree on that they don't want the government. I'll give you a good example, the Equality Act, which sort of died on the vine, but was like real popular whenever in the Democratic primary 5 years ago. Just the idea that you can't discriminate against someone based on their sexual orientation or gender identity, which sounds great unless you're religious, because it means that you can't fire someone for coming out as gay, like a school teacher, like you have a parochial school, or, your pastor comes out as trans. You can't fire him. And guess what? Churches don't want that. Mosques don't want that. Synagogues don't want that. They want to have, the freedom to hire and fire who they see fit, who aligns with their religious doctrine. But then, non-religious people say, well, that's discrimination. So, I think that's where a clear issue where like LDS and Catholics and evangelicals all go, oh yeah, like we don't want that. We don't want the government to tell us who our pastor can and can't be. And I think that you're going to find common cause, maybe not a bunch of instances, but there's going to be instances in the future where, yeah, that's a wild picture in my head, but I think it's very possible in the future, and more likely as the nuns continue to rise, because they become the enemy. Right? Like, we got to push back in secularism. And as long as you believe in something, that's better than those people. So let's join hands and fight for that cause.
Yeah. So one final question that I think ties the Mormons to one of your central arguments in the book, because you argue that this polarization of religious communities is making it so America is losing one of its last spaces where people from divergent ideological, political, and demographic backgrounds can come together. But it's striking to me that the Latter-day Saints are one of the few religious denominations where you're still required to attend a congregation based on your geographic proximity. That there's a sense of forcing you to sit next to people in the pews. Now, of course, Latter-day Saints have gone through a similar homogenization process as everyone else. But do you think that that's something that might help Latter-day Saints stave off those broader corrosions that you discuss in the book?
It's funny. I had a guy actually mention this to me last night after a talk. The fact like you're sort of forced to go to this local church means that you're going to be forced to go to a church that maybe you wouldn't choose on your own. And could we sort of export that model to other, religious groups? And the answer is that's a great model. It would never export though, because Protestants are not going to be told what to do. Like they're going to drive past 7 churches to go to the church they like, or a different town to go to the church they like. Now, Catholics are a bit different because in most towns that are not very large, there's one Catholic church and everyone goes to that one Catholic church. In bigger towns, you do have options, right? There's 6, 7, 8 different Catholic parishes you can go to. I think the model is a great idea. The problem is and I do think that's one of the things LDS do really well from a social science perspective is like that sort of forced mixing, like arranged marriages, right? But the problem with Protestants is that would never work structurally. Like they would be like, what? I don't want to go to that church. I want to go to the church down the road because they're more like me. So, it's great in theory. It's completely impossible in practice, especially in Protestant Christianity. Because guess what? Protestants will break up over anything. And they have broken up over everything. And I mean, the color of the carpet has divided churches before. So the idea of like, we're going to force you to go to church with people who you disagree with politically. And that's really the nub of the whole book, though, is like what I'm saying here is what's bad for your church is good for democracy. And like, I would rather pastor a church that was 100% homogenous, whatever it was, left, right, or center. I'd rather it just be like, if it was all a bunch of like old, rich, white Republicans, boy, that'd be an easy church to pastor. But the problem, though, is that's not good for democracy because it doesn't teach us toleration and differences and compromise. So that's the sort of inherent tension of this whole thing is these groups I'm basically telling them to go against their own self-interest. And I don't know how to get over that unless you're the LDS and you say, hey, you got no other options. Protestants would run for the hills if that was presented to them.
So if I can summarize your positions, then you're saying that Protestantism needs an LDS prophet and they should embrace arranged marriages. Is that right?
Hey, listen, the data on arranged marriages say they're almost as successful as choice marriages. So, I mean, I'm a big believer in like just going to a place and putting down roots and what, like come what may, you're going to stick around. But that's not what most people have. You know what I mean? Like they don't like what happened 2 weeks ago. They're gone. I think that's the bigger problem, right? Is Protestants give people too many options, which I think is a real problem. Fewer options. Maybe I'm arguing for communism here. Really, that's what I'm arguing. Don't clip that out, but I'm arguing for communism here.
We won't share that with your Missouri legislatures where your school's located. You might be able to get away from it in Illinois. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me, Dr. Burge. This is a wonderful book. I hope other people pick it up, and I appreciate you giving me some of your time.
Thank you so much.
I want to thank Dr. Burge for giving me some of his time. He is a very wanted scholar right now with all his great studies and speaking to various groups and on radios. So I'm glad that he was able to share his wisdom with this audience. I really strongly recommend going to get the book. And you can also read a Washington Post essay that goes along with the book that I'll link to in the video description. I think some of the lessons for the Mormon tradition are quite clear out of this story. On the one hand, Mormons are largely following this general trend toward political homogeneity. Between 1960 and 2012, Mormons have become more unified conservative with nearly every election. Things became a bit more complicated with Trump in 2016 for reasons that I've got into in other videos, but not enough to buck this trend. They've also become much more theologically and socially homogenous, which is a result of the church's own push for correlation, a project started in the 1960s, but also a general trend in which people now are much more expected to participate in groups where everyone agrees. You also see a decline in religious activity, even with the rise of religious identity. As I've discussed in previous videos, Mormons today are much less likely to attend church every week, to practice the word of wisdom, to read their scriptures and pray, and yet they're more likely to identify religion as a core part, which means they are seeing it more as a tribal identity than a way of life. It can also map onto their political identities, which is why you see lots of Mormons denouncing people like Mitt Romney as a fake Mormon because he does not match their political agenda. If you want to see evidence for that, just go see the comments on my recent Mitt Romney video here. And also, as I discussed with Dr. Burge, this political and cultural realignment also enabled Mormons to participate with the religious right movement because it grants them a seat at their table because they have the same enemies as evangelicals. You also see this trend overlap in how many of the Latter-day Saints who leave the faith are joining the Church of the Nuns. At least a large number of those who fall away from the LDS tradition, have the same issues as ex-evangelicals, and therefore they don't join another institution. Jana Risa's own research on ex-Mormons has shown that when these people leave the Mormon faith, they don't join another church. But I think there are areas in which Mormons don't really fit into the broader trend, some of which I talked with Dr. Burge. Because Latter-day Saints don't get to choose which congregation they go to, they are forced to mix a bit more. Although because of this homogenizing trend within Mormonism, I don't think you see as much diversity in the pews now as you did a few decades ago. And further, the LDS institutional presence does add some complications because the church can come out and make stances on issues that you do not see in evangelical traditions that don't have the same top-down structure. You can see this on both the tensions of both the right and the left, with progressives upset with the church's stance on LGBTQ issues, or conservatives upset with the church's stance on vaccines or immigration. So I think that Mormonism fit somewhat uncomfortably in these larger trends that we need to still understand to picture how Latter-day Saints fit into their environment. I think this topic is a good reminder that much of what we take for granted now has not always been the case, that this God gap in American culture and politics, the religious right and the secular left, is mostly a recent creation, which also implies that the future is not set in stone. Can Democratic politicians like Ralph Warnock or James Tallarico resurrect a religious left? Can Mormon progressives shift their faith in different directions? Those are all things that we'll have to see going forward. But I think the lesson from this video that I hope you take is that we need to keep this wider picture in mind when discussing Mormonism's ever-present membership questions. The decline of membership, the homogenization of belief, all of this is taking place within a broader context. I hope this video made sense. If you enjoyed it, please hit the like button, subscribe to this channel as we are marching toward 15,000 subscribers, a fact that really blows my mind, for which I'm really grateful. And please share the video with your friends so that we can broaden the conversation. History has never been more relevant than it is today because it reminds us that these cultural facets that we take for granted are modern inventions, which means we should be able to dissect them and better understand where we come from and perhaps where we're going from here.